In the year 1700, inside the royal palace of Madrid, the last Habsburg king of Spain lay dying. He was just 38 years old, but years of illness had reduced him to a shadow of a man. His body was failing in almost every way. He could barely chew or swallow food because his lower jaw jutted forward so far that his teeth could not meet. His tongue was enlarged, and his speech was nearly impossible to understand. He suffered from epileptic seizures and could not father any children. Courtiers whispered that King Charles II was cursed. They called him the Bewitched. Desperate to break the spell, Charles had even allowed priests to perform exorcisms on him, and he carried amulets made from human hair and nail clippings given by mystics. But no prayers or potions could save him. On November 1st, 1700, Charles II died, ending the 300-year rule of the Habsburg Dynasty in Spain. When doctors performed the autopsy, their findings sounded like something from a horror story. His corpse, they said, did not contain a single drop of blood. His heart was the size of a peppercorn. His lungs were corroded, his intestines rotten and gangrenous. He had one testicle black as coal, and his head was full of water. These grotesque details, whether exaggerated or not, symbolized the ruin of a once mighty royal line. The Habsburg family's obsession with keeping power all in the family through inbreeding had culminated in a king so genetically broken that he could not produce an heir. With Charles's death, the Spanish Habsburg dynasty became extinct. An empire that had once spanned the globe fell into chaos, all because the royal bloodline had been too pure. This is the story of the Habsburgs, a royal family that rose to unimaginable power through marriage, only to doom itself through generations of intermarriage. It is the story of the infamous Habsburg jaw, a facial deformity that became the ugly symbol of their decline. And it is a warning of how centuries of incestuous unions destroyed the health of a dynasty and, in the end, its empire. To understand how inbreeding toppled the Habsburgs, we first need to see how marriage built their empire. The House of Habsburg was not always Europe's most powerful royal family. They began as minor nobles in medieval Switzerland, controlling little more than a single castle perched in the Alps. But by the 15th and 16th centuries, they had discovered a powerful formula for building empires: forge alliances by marriage instead of battle. The Habsburg motto said it best: "Let others wage war, you, happy Austria, marry." It was a brilliant strategy. While other kingdoms spent fortunes on armies and lost thousands of men in battle, the Habsburgs simply married their way to power. A wedding could achieve what years of warfare could not: territories, wealth, and crowns, all acquired peacefully at the altar. Generation after generation, they arranged marriages with other royal houses to acquire new lands and titles. Rather than conquering kingdoms on the battlefield, they inherited them through carefully planned unions. This strategy reached its height with Maximilian I in the late 1400s. Maximilian, a Habsburg archduke, was a charismatic and ambitious ruler. In 1477, he made a brilliant match with Mary of Burgundy, the wealthiest heiress in Europe. When Mary's father, Charles the Bold, died in battle, she inherited the rich Burgundian lands, modern-day Belgium, Luxembourg, and parts of France and the Netherlands. Maximilian married her, and overnight the Habsburgs controlled one of Europe's wealthiest regions. But Maximilian didn't stop there. He arranged marriages for his children with surgical precision. His son Philip married Joanna of Castile, daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, the same monarchs who funded Christopher Columbus. That single marriage would eventually bring Spain and all its New World colonies under Habsburg control. Maximilian also married his daughter Margaret to the heir of Spain and his grandson Ferdinand to the heir of Hungary and Bohemia. Every wedding was a calculated move on the chessboard of European power. Through similar unions, the family came to rule Austria, parts of Italy, Spain, the Netherlands, and eventually territories stretching from Mexico to the Philippines. By 1519, Maximilian's grandson Charles V sat atop an empire so vast it was called the Empire on which the sun never sets. He was both Holy Roman Emperor and King of Spain, ruling over territories that stretched across Europe, the Americas, and parts of Asia. Charles V was perhaps the most powerful man of the 16th century, and he owed much of that power to his lineage, a web of royal marriages that had merged crowns into his hands. Even at the height of his glory, though, there were signs of trouble. Charles himself was the product of generations of cousin marriages. His parents were closely related. His father, Philip the Handsome, was the son of Maximilian I. His mother, Joanna of Castile, was the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, but she was also descended from multiple Habsburg lines. Charles had a strikingly prominent jaw and chin, the earliest visible example of what would become known as the Habsburg jaw. Portraits show a protruding lower jaw and a thick lower lip, traits passed down from his ancestors. His lower teeth sat in front of his upper teeth, creating a severe underbite that made chewing difficult and speaking awkward. When the 16-year-old Charles first arrived in Spain in 1516 to assume the throne, his jaw was so pronounced that one peasant supposedly shouted, "Your Majesty, shut your mouth. The flies of this country are very insolent." Charles could not fully close his mouth because of the deformity. It was a comical story, but also a warning. The Habsburgs themselves didn't recognize these physical traits as a danger. In their world, marrying within one's extended family was not unusual. Royal blood was sacred and power was preserved through carefully arranged unions. Keeping wealth and titles within the family was considered wise. Bringing in outsiders risked losing control, diluting the bloodline, or inviting foreign influence. The Habsburgs simply took that logic further than anyone else, and they would pay for it in the centuries to come. After Emperor Charles V, the Habsburg Empire was so vast that it had to be divided. Charles abdicated in 1556, exhausted by decades of war and the burdens of ruling half the world. He split his dominions between his brother Ferdinand, who took Austria and the Holy Roman Empire, and his son Philip II, who took Spain, the Netherlands, and Spain's global colonies. From that moment on, the family existed in two great branches, the Austrian Habsburgs and the Spanish Habsburgs. Both continued their tradition of intermarriage, but it was in Spain that the problem would grow catastrophic. The Spanish Habsburgs understood that their power came through marriage, not conquest. Spain was fabulously wealthy, enriched by gold and silver flowing from the Americas, but the empire was fragile, held together by family ties and dynastic loyalty. Determined to keep Spain under Habsburg rule at any cost, they began marrying almost exclusively within their own family. Rather than bringing in new blood from other royal houses, they looked to their Austrian cousins or even closer relatives for brides and grooms. Over the 184 years that the Habsburgs ruled Spain, there were 11 major royal marriages, and 9 of them were between close blood relatives. That statistic alone reveals how deep the inbreeding ran. Philip II, son of Charles V, set the precedent by marrying 2 of his own relatives. His first wife was his cousin Maria of Portugal. Later, after 2 other non-relative wives, Philip married his niece Anna of Austria. That union meant his children were even more inbred than himself. Their gene pool had shrunk dramatically. Philip III, the son of Philip II and Anna, married his cousin Margaret of Austria. Their son, Philip IV, continued the pattern and made it worse. Philip IV married twice. His first wife, Elizabeth of France, was his cousin. After her death, he married his own niece, Maria Anna of Austria, his sister's daughter. In other words, he married his niece. Their son would be Charles II, the last and most tragic of the Spanish Habsburgs. The result was a family tree that twisted in on itself like a knot. Genealogists who study the Habsburg lineage describe it as a pedigree collapse, where the number of unique ancestors shrinks with each generation. By the time we reach the late 1600s, the Spanish Habsburgs had far fewer unique ancestors than a normal person would. A typical person 5 generations back would have 32 distinct great-great-great-grandparents. Charles II, the last Habsburg king of Spain, had only 10. 7 of his 8 great-grandparents were all descended from the same couple, Queen Joanna of Castile and her husband Philip of Habsburg. The genetic deck kept being reshuffled with the same cards, generation after generation. Modern scientists estimate that 25% of Charles's genes were identical pairs inherited from common ancestors on both sides. That's the same genetic similarity you would find between a child and their own parent or sibling. In genetic terms, Charles II was more inbred than the offspring of a brother and sister. The Spanish Habsburgs were, quite literally, breeding within a closed circle, and each generation paid a steeper price. Why did they do it? Partly because of politics and partly because of superstition. The Habsburgs saw their bloodline as sacred. To them, their divine right to rule came from their ancestry, and marrying outside that circle would dilute it. They believed their blood was touched by God, that they were chosen to rule, and that mixing with commoners or even lesser nobles would weaken their legitimacy. They also feared losing control. Every royal marriage was a political gamble. Marrying a foreign princess meant bringing in her family's influence, her advisors, her loyalties. Marrying within the family kept power centralized and predictable. But there was another reason, darker and more irrational. They blamed their troubles on anything except themselves. They knew their children were sickly, that infants died, that their kings were weak, but they blamed witches, demons, or bad fortune, never their own family choices. When children were born deformed or died young, the Habsburgs called it God's will, a curse, or the work of Satan. They never once considered that the problem was in their blood. As the generations passed, Europeans began to notice something peculiar. Habsburg faces were starting to look alike, and not in a flattering way. Members of the dynasty shared the same unmistakable feature, a large protruding lower jaw and thick drooping lower lip. It became their family trademark. Doctors today call this condition mandibular prognathism, where the lower jaw extends forward beyond the upper jaw. In many Habsburgs, the upper jaw was also underdeveloped, giving the face a hollowed, sunken look. The result was a heavy chin, an underbite, and a mouth that often could not close properly. In portraits by great artists like Titian and Velázquez, generation after generation of Habsburg rulers appear with that same jutting chin and long lip. Artists were expected to flatter their royal subjects, yet even they could not hide the deformity. By the 17th century, the so-called Habsburg jaw had become a symbol of the dynasty itself. People joked that you could recognize a Habsburg simply by their profile, but this was more than a cosmetic issue. The deformity caused real suffering. Those with the most pronounced jaws found it hard to chew, bite, or even speak clearly. Food had to be mashed or softened. Speech was slurred and difficult to understand. It is said that Charles V could not close his mouth entirely, and that the flies of Spain were bold enough to make use of it, a crude but telling story that reflected both his power and his curse. Marie Antoinette, the future Queen of France, and a descendant of the Austrian branch, also had a mild version of the Habsburg look. In her case, it gave her a delicate pout that some found charming, but for others the jaw was a nightmare. Philip IV's portraits show a man with a long, drooping face and a jutting chin so severe it looks painful. His son, Charles II, had it worst of all. His lower jaw extended so far forward that his teeth could not meet, making eating a torment. In recent years, scientists have compared the severity of the jaw in old Habsburg portraits with detailed genealogies. They measured the degree of prognathism in dozens of paintings and correlated it with the level of inbreeding in each individual's family tree. The results confirmed what history long suspected. The more inbred a Habsburg was, the more extreme their jaw deformity tended to be. The feature was hereditary, likely caused by recessive genes that became more and more common with each generation of intermarriage. When both parents carried the gene, their children inherited it in full force. The Habsburg jaw was only the visible sign of a deeper genetic collapse. Behind the regal faces were weakened bodies and fragile health. What had begun as a quest to preserve royal purity had become a biological trap. Inbreeding is dangerous because it multiplies the chances of passing on hidden genetic defects. Every human carries some harmful recessive genes, mutations that cause disease or deformity but remain hidden as long as there's a healthy copy of the gene from the other parent. When close relatives reproduce, the odds increase dramatically that a child will inherit 2 copies of the same harmful gene, one from each parent. Over 2 centuries, the Habsburgs provided one of the most striking examples in human history of what can happen when a family ignores that truth. The price they paid was visible in their children, babies born weak, sick, and often dead before their 10th birthday. Records show that only about half of the Habsburg children in 17th century Spain survived to the age of 10. In most Spanish families of the time, the survival rate was around 80%. Even accounting for the harsh realities of pre-modern medicine, the Habsburg infant mortality rate was catastrophic. Miscarriages, stillbirths, and infant deaths haunted the royal palace. Many newborns lived only a few days or weeks. Even those who survived were often frail or mentally impaired. The royal physicians described heirs who could barely walk, princes who suffered seizures, and princesses who wasted away in childhood. One of the most tragic was little Prince Philip Prospero, heir to the throne before Charles II. Philip Prospero was born in 1657, the son of King Philip IV and his niece Maria Anna. From birth, he was sickly and weak. Court painters captured him in portraits wearing protective amulets. Bells and charms hung around his waist to ward off evil spirits. He suffered constant illness, fevers, fits, difficulty breathing. His body was frail, his limbs thin. Despite the best care the royal court could provide, he grew weaker with each passing year. At age 4, after years of epileptic fits and sickness, Philip Prospero died. His death devastated the royal family and left Spain without a clear heir. The only remaining son was Charles, born a year after Philip Prospero's death, the boy who would become the last broken king. As the centuries of cousin marriages piled up, the dynasty began to collapse from the inside. Each new king was weaker than the one before. By the time Charles II was born, the damage was irreversible. Charles came into the world in 1661, frail and sickly from birth. Doctors did not expect him to survive infancy. His mother, Queen Maria Anna, had already lost multiple children to illness and stillbirth. When Charles lived past his first weeks, there was cautious hope, but it quickly became clear that something was terribly wrong. He did survive, but he was never healthy. His tongue was enlarged, his jaw protruding, and he could not speak clearly until the age of 4. Some accounts say he didn't walk until he was nearly 8 years old. He had to be spoon-fed like a child even in his teenage years because chewing solid food was almost impossible. His jaw extended so far forward that his teeth could not meet. His tongue was too large for his mouth. His speech was slow, slurred, and difficult for others to understand. Throughout his life, he suffered one illness after another: measles, smallpox, fevers, seizures. He was small, weak, and pale. His limbs were thin, his body underdeveloped. He looked more like a sickly child than a king. His portraits show a ghostly figure with a long chin, wide mouth, and lifeless eyes. Diego Velázquez and other court painters tried their best to make him look regal, but even their skill could not hide the truth. Diplomats described him as kind but slow, passive, and easily manipulated. One French ambassador wrote, "The King of Spain is so ugly, he frightens one and he looks as if he were ill." The people of Spain whispered that their king had been cursed. They called him El Hechizado, the bewitched. Priests performed exorcisms, monks and mystics gave him charms and amulets made of hair and fingernails to protect him from evil spirits. Charles believed them all. He prayed endlessly, confessed his sins, and blamed his misfortune on witchcraft. But the truth was in his blood. Geneticists today believe that Charles suffered from two rare inherited disorders: combined pituitary hormone deficiency and distal renal tubular acidosis, conditions that explain his stunted growth, his weakness, his infertility, and even his cognitive impairment. His body was the product of centuries of inbreeding. His parents were uncle and niece, and both were already heavily inbred themselves. By the time he was born, Charles's family tree no longer branched, it folded in on itself. More than 90% of his genes came from the same small pool of ancestors, repeated over and over again. Charles married twice, hoping desperately to produce an heir and continue the dynasty. His first wife was Marie-Louise of Orléans, a French princess. She was young, healthy, and beautiful, but after 10 years of marriage, there were no children. Marie-Louise died suddenly in 1689, possibly from poisoning, though some blamed Charles's inability to consummate the marriage. His second wife, Maria Anna of Neuburg, fared no better. She too remained childless throughout their marriage. Desperate for an heir, the court tried everything: prayers, potions, exorcisms, pilgrimages, but Charles was almost certainly sterile. His body simply could not produce children. When he died in 1700 at just 38 years old, his autopsy revealed the full horror. His body was described as bloodless, his heart tiny, his lungs corroded, his intestines gangrenous. He had only one small, shriveled testicle, black as coal. His brain was filled with water, a sign of severe neurological damage. His skeleton was weak and deformed. The royal physicians were horrified by what they found. It was the perfect, terrible symbol of what centuries of royal inbreeding could do to a dynasty. With his death, the Spanish branch of the Habsburg family came to an end. There was no heir, no son to continue the line. The throne passed to a new dynasty, the Bourbons of France, and the once mighty Habsburg Empire fractured in war. The death of Charles II marked the end of 3 centuries of Habsburg rule in Spain. His body was barely cold when Europe erupted into chaos. With no heir to inherit the Spanish throne, rival powers rushed to claim the remains of his vast empire. The result was the War of the Spanish Succession, a brutal conflict that tore Europe apart for more than a decade. From 1701 to 1713, France, Austria, Britain, the Dutch Republic, and dozens of other powers took sides. Armies marched across Spain, Italy, the Netherlands, and Germany. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers and civilians died. Cities were besieged, economies ruined, and entire regions devastated, all because one family had been too obsessed with keeping their bloodline pure. In the end, Spain passed to a new ruler, Philip of Anjou, grandson of the French king Louis XIV. He became Philip V, the first Bourbon king of Spain. The old Habsburg Empire was gone forever, divided among new powers. France gained influence, while Austria took control of former Spanish lands in Italy and the Netherlands. An empire that had once stretched across continents collapsed because one family had been too proud to mix its blood. The tragedy of the Habsburgs became a lesson written across history, a reminder that even kings cannot escape the laws of nature. Their obsession with purity, their fear of losing power, and their refusal to marry beyond their own circle doomed them from within. Modern science confirms what history suspected. Studies of their family tree show that each generation was more inbred than the last. Genetic researchers have calculated that the extreme inbreeding in the Spanish Habsburgs reduced their children's chances of survival by nearly 20%. In simple terms, they had bred themselves into extinction. The Habsburg jaw, once seen as a symbol of royal lineage, became a mark of decay. It was a physical signature of centuries of genetic decline, the face of power eaten away from the inside. Paintings from the time almost tell the story themselves. Proud rulers with golden crowns and velvet robes, but faces twisted by the deformity that defined their bloodline. The downfall of the Habsburgs sent a message to every royal house in Europe. The idea of keeping bloodlines pure began to fade. Other dynasties learned from their fate, marrying further afield to strengthen alliances and restore health to their families. Queen Victoria of Britain married a German prince, Albert of Saxe-Coburg. Their children married into nearly every royal house in Europe, spreading fresh bloodlines across the continent. The Austrian branch of the Habsburgs survived for 2 more centuries, ruling Central Europe until the First World War, but they too could not escape the shadow of their past. By the 19th century, the Austrian Habsburgs were still intermarrying, though less intensely than their Spanish cousins. Emperor Franz Joseph, who ruled for 68 years, married his cousin Elizabeth of Bavaria. Their only son, Crown Prince Rudolf, died by suicide in 1889. When the First World War ended in 1918, the Habsburg Empire finally collapsed. Austria-Hungary was dissolved, and the last emperor, Charles I, abdicated and went into exile. The dynasty that had once ruled half of Europe was gone. Today, the story of the Habsburgs remains one of history's most haunting examples of how power and pride can destroy even the mightiest of empires. Their name still echoes in museums, history books, and portraits, a warning carved into time. The palaces they built still stand. The Hofburg in Vienna, the Royal Palace in Madrid, the art they collected fills the greatest museums of Europe. Paintings by Velázquez, Titian, Rubens, all commissioned to glorify a dynasty that is now extinct. Their portraits hang in galleries around the world, silent witnesses to a genetic catastrophe. Tourists walk past them, marveling at the strange faces, the jutting jaws, the long chins, the hollow eyes. Few realize they are looking at the physical evidence of one of history's greatest tragedies. The Habsburgs believed they were chosen by God. They built their empire through marriage, not war, and in the end, it was marriage that brought them down. The curse of the Habsburgs was never witchcraft or demons. It was the silent, invisible hand of their own blood, turning generation after generation of kings into fragile shadows of their ancestors. No empire, no matter how vast or divine it seems, can outlast the limits of the human body. The Habsburgs learned that too late. Their dynasty, once the most powerful in Europe, died with a whisper, the last breath of a king who could barely speak. And the lesson remains: power built on purity is power built on sand. In the end, even kings must bow to the laws of nature. This has been Bloodline Chronicles.